A good-hearted landlord had her property taken over by squatters who proceeded to use the house as a drug den, have the place occupied by more than 30 tenants, and eventually it was condemned by the city. Now she's living in a homeless shelter. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have a crazy story for you coming out of Colorado, right? Now, this is probably one of the worst case scenarios that I've read about in terms of squatters taking over a person's property. And it all started by this lady, trying to be kind to somebody by allowing them to stay in the home, right? And it turned into an absolute nightmare, okay? It's a pretty detailed story, and I'm going to be going through all of it in just a moment. I hate reading about these squatter situations because even if you're not put into a situation where you personally are homeless, like the lady in this article, it still can end up costing you thousands of dollars worth of property damage or months on end going through courts and legal processes trying to get these people out of your place, okay? And, it's absolutely a nightmare. And I don't want to have to go through it. I don't think any other landlord wants to have to go through it either. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like, subscribe button, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think, okay? So have you ever experienced squatters moving into one of your properties? And if you have, what exactly happened? How did you get them out of there? Okay, I'm just curious to know the stories from other landlords on the internet, okay? So let's get into this article because it's a long one and it's pretty detailed and I want to go over all those details. So this article is coming from Gazette.com and it says, squatters take over a Colorado Springs home. Now the owner is in a homeless shelter. Yeah, I mean, it got so bad that this lady now has no place to live. So let's get into it. B. Lynn found herself homeless after her good intentions squared off against bad people. The clash led to squatters illegally occupying and trashing her once nice home in a middle-class neighborhood in northeast Colorado Springs. And for more than 3 months, Lynn has been seesawing between living in her car and staying in a homeless shelter. Meanwhile, her home is now on the city's list of 38 dilapidated and condemned residences. People think I'm crazy when they hear what happened, she said. My life has not gone well at all. I blame myself. The tragic irony of Lynn ending up homeless after squatters took over her property, which she and her now estranged husband had purchased as a newly built Richmond home in the mid-1980s, is uncommon, said Glenn Shellhouse, who does unpaid street outreach for Rocky Mountain Human Services. As an agency volunteer, he's been helping homeless people get back on their feet for 7 years. Yeah, so it sounds awful. She's going between living in her car and living at the homeless shelter because of what these squatters did to her property. She can't even move back in there. And, it's awful, okay? I mean, what do you do when you're put in a situation like this? And, the question remains, how did she get into this situation? How did she end up living in her car while her house is destroyed and, the squatters basically used it? Well, let's get down a little bit further in this article because, it does a little explanation of what squatting is. We already know all that, but I'm more interested in this lady's specific story. Lynn's case is more of an extreme. Good-heartedness led to her being taken advantage of, which the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated and created even more difficulties righting what went wrong. I act strong, but I'm not, said Lynn, who's in her 60s. I don't want to show it. Colorado Springs was home base for Lynn's military family who moved around while raising their children. They also traveled when her husband exited military service and worked for a government department. The couple never rented out the house while they were on job assignments. It stood empty and waited for them, she said. They also never had problems until 4 years ago when her husband retired and they returned to Colorado Springs for good. Lynn, who was born in Taiwan and immigrated as a young woman, and her husband had hired a remodeling crew to spruce up the property. One of the guys said he didn't have any money or any place to stay or credit, she explained while showing the ruins of her house. I felt sorry for him. I was so cold out. The couple provided a basement bedroom in their 5-bedroom home, with Lynn being her hospitable self, cooking for the man and making sure he was comfortable. So yeah, this lady, She, was living in the house 4 years ago. They decided to remodel the house, right? And one of the contractors who was working on the house said he didn't have any money, didn't have anywhere to stay. So she opened up the home to this guy, right? And basically became a landlord at that point. So yeah, that it's an act of kind-heartedness. I personally wouldn't have done that, but some people are much nicer than me. Okay, so yeah, it's a bad situation when that is the catalyst that started this whole problem. But let's continue. The couple, I'm sorry, I already read that. But he soon brought a relative to live there, she said, and eventually sneaked in a girlfriend. When Lynn found a hypodermic needle in the dryer, she had had enough. We kicked them out, she said, but she had given the man a key to the home and didn't ask for it back. When marital problems surfaced, Lynn fled to Florida and left her husband behind. She thought he was continuing to live in the residence, but then she began receiving calls from the city's code enforcement about issues at the Colorado Springs house. So yeah, so basically it went like this, right? They kicked this person out, okay? Just told this guy, you've got to go, etc. But they didn't get the key back from him. They didn't change the locks. And so he still had that key. So then she goes through this marital issue, with her husband. Her and her husband, they separate, and she moves to Florida. And meanwhile, her husband, she thinks, well, he stayed behind. He's taking care of the property. No problem. But apparently that isn't what happened. Her husband had abandoned the home, and his whereabouts are still unknown to Lynn and code enforcement, who have tried to contact him. Squatters told city authorities who would come to the house that the owner had died or was on vacation. Squatters also transferred utility accounts to their names and accumulated $18,000 in outstanding bills, which accrued during COVID leniency, Kinter said. If I would have known what was going to happen, Lynn said, I would have never left. So yeah, her husband disappeared. Who knows where he went, right? And while he was gone and while she was down in Florida, squatters moved in. They got the utilities turned on in their name. And this is probably all associated with that very first guy who had the key to their house, who had drug issues. And guess what? He turned this place into a homeless drug den. Okay. And so all of a sudden she's getting calls from code compliance for the city of Colorado Springs. And she's like, what's going on? What's going on? And she had no clue all this was happening. On top of that, right, these tenants accumulated $18,000 worth of utility debt. They turned the utilities on in their name, but because of the COVID pandemic, guess what? They didn't turn the utilities off like they normally would when the person doesn't pay. So now, I don't know how it works in Colorado Springs, but from the sound of the article, it sounds like she is responsible for that debt, even though she didn't turn the utilities on and, she wasn't the one who used all that electricity. Because she's the homeowner, she has to pay that debt off. That's why I say I'm against that sort of law. It's absolutely ridiculous that someone who wasn't responsible for a debt ends up stuck with it. But that's what these cities do to people. Anyway, I'm going to keep going. While in Florida, Lynn became ill, suffered injuries from a car crash, and underwent several surgeries, which she said prevented her from returning to Colorado Springs until June of this year. The state of her beloved retirement dream left her feeling as broken as the home looked. From 2018 to May of this year, but particularly during the pandemic, the residence was a central hub for homeless people, neighbors told her, with at one point up to 30 people staying there. I kept the house up real good, Lynn said, fighting back tears while looking at the empty rooms. Squatters left behind holes and writing on the walls, bare wooden floors that previously had plush carpeting, gouging countertops, missing light fixtures, wrecked plumbing, zero furniture, mice feces, and a lingering odor of discontent. But the property's appearance is much better than its condition in June, when code enforcement condemned it. It was completely filled with trash, rodents, debris, Kinter said. Things were scurrying everywhere. In May, after pandemic restrictions on tenancy and evictions lifted, $7,500 in outstanding utility bills on the house remained, and Colorado Springs Utilities tagged the water heater for being unsafe. Code enforcement officers received municipal court orders for entrance and seizure warrants. Wow, this is awful, okay? So basically, they completely destroyed this house. And, she was, injured and sick down in Florida, couldn't return and take care of the issue, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And now the place is condemned. And, this is this lady's home, okay? So she doesn't have anywhere to live, it's destroyed. And I can't believe that it got that far, but man, it's just insane. Authorities told about 15 people to leave due to unsafe and unsanitary conditions, and in June, code enforcement boarded up the house. The damage that had been done was extensive and required a huge load of work to clear out. But even after the barricading entryways, posting signs, and changing the locks, Lynn said people continued trying to get in. She points out marks on the doors where people attempted to break the new locks and where basement windows were shattered to bypass the blockades. Whew. I hate reading a story like this. Basically this lady's house is gone. She's ended up living in her car or in the homeless shelter. There is a solution for this lady though, right? She bought this house back in the 1980s. Her husband, who knows where this guy is at, right? Hopefully she's able to find him. And my suggestion is, being a real estate investor, this house is not beyond the scope of what some real estate investors are willing to handle, right? She said it was in a good part of town, a nice middle-class neighborhood, and all they really need to do is find a good cash buyer, one who has plenty of money to flip that house, and just offload it, right? Take your earned equity and then move on to somewhere else. Get yourself a nice apartment or something somewhere else. That's what I suggest to this lady, okay? Hopefully she's able to find her husband and get everything sorted out. Because, I don't like hearing about, somebody stuck living in their car because of a situation like this. So yeah, awful story. This is another one of those things. Landlords beware. Beware who you trust. Always, keep an eye on your properties. Don't let them sit vacant for a long period of time. This sort of thing is bound to happen. People, they look out for vacant properties so that they know, oh yeah, we could sneak in there and, either steal or stay there or whatever. So yeah, it's a word of warning to landlords and heck, homeowners too.